Uh, Guys, we are so glad that we get to gather today and we get to worship God. And I'm sure you noticed there's a tub in the middle of the room. And so that means it's Baptism Sunday. We get to celebrate those who want to declare that they have chosen to follow Christ, that they have been made new. And so this is going to be a super, super exciting morning. This is also our last week in our series called Promised. We've been journeying for the past 3 weeks, and this is our 4th week, looking sort of a deep dive into the book of Genesis. We've been looking at the promises that God bestowed upon sort of this family, Abraham's family, and we've been looking at the story of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and now today we're going to talk about Joseph. It's these 4 characters in the biblical narrative have this really unique role that they play in the mission of God to redeem and restore, to make whole the entire world. And the interesting thing about this story is you'd think that God would choose people who were perfect, who sort of had it all together, who knew what they were doing, who were always faithful, but he doesn't. Instead, we have these characters who really want to trust God, but they don't always, who really want to be faithful, but sometimes they do the complete opposite thing and prove themselves to be faithless. They're just like us, really. And the cool thing about this is that even though they are faithless, God continues to do what he promised to do. He doesn't let that stand in the way. He continues to be faithful even when they're faithless. And so the past couple weeks, we've seen the story of Abraham, that even when he was impatient, God was still faithful. That Abraham's impatient makes things really painful, but God still says, I'm going to give you the gift of this promised child. I'm going to give you Isaac. And then Isaac, his son, actually has 2 sons, and that complicates things even more. There was a problem when there was no son, but there's a bigger problem when there's 2, because now the question is, who gets the blessing? Who's the favorite? Who's the one that God will use? Who's the one that God chooses? And so even at birth, there's this rivalry that begins. There's this jockeying for favor and blessing and being the best and the most important between Jacob and his brother Esau. And it all kind of comes to this head when Jacob manipulates his dad and pretends to be someone that he's not in order to secure this blessing. But instead of him finally being fulfilled, what actually happens is he doesn't feel fulfilled. He still feels wanting. He still feels like he's missing out on something. And in actuality, he ruins and decimates his whole family. His dad doesn't love him anymore. His brother now hates him. And the one person in his family who loves him, his mother, has to send him away to make sure that his life is preserved. And so he continues to struggle to feel like he's chosen by God. And then last week, we talked about the climax of Jacob's life where he is sent home to go back to his family and to meet Esau. And he's terrified because Esau is going to kill him. He's pretty sure Esau is going to kill him. And so he sort of sends everyone ahead, all of his wives and all of his children and all of his possessions ahead as this gift to Esau to try to butter him up. And he hangs way back. And what happens in the middle of the night is this man comes out of nowhere and starts wrestling with him, and we find out that was God, that Jacob is wrestling with God. And so often we're told that we're not supposed to wrestle with God. We're not supposed to question him. We're not supposed to doubt him. And yet here we have this picture of Jacob wrestling with God, of sort of asking all of the questions. And in time, Jacob finally surrenders. He holds on to God and he says, I won't let go until you bless me. And God blesses him. And it's in that wrestling that Jacob finds this new name and this new identity and new humility and new future that he's being called into. And for us, wrestling with God isn't a bad thing. It's a good thing. It's this thing that means that we haven't given up, that we're still alive, that we're still asking the questions. It means that we can still come to God, that we haven't been bested by our doubts and our brokenness or our questions. It means that we too can experience a new identity and a new humility and a new clarity about our future that God is calling us to step into. Now, when Jacob meets his brother Esau, there's this long parade of gifts, and Esau actually forgives his brother, which is this incredible thing. God has also been working behind the scenes to do something in Esau's life, to soften his heart, to change Esau's understanding of what this whole blessing thing means, so that Esau can embrace his brother and forgive him. Now, at the end of that very long line of wives and children and gifts is Jacob's favorite son, born to him by his favorite wife. And his favorite son's name is Joseph. Now, for me, this part of the story is really ironic because Jacob's the tragedy and the devastating part of Jacob's life is that his father chose a favorite, Esau, wasn't him. And you'd think that Jacob would learn from his father's mistakes. You think that he would choose something different and say, hey, this generation, I'm going to set things right. I'm not choosing a favorite. I will love both my sons equally for the differences that they have in them and blah, 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 right? Jacob's like, no, I have a favorite. It's Joseph. He's my favorite. And so it, just like in the generation before, it leads to like terrible family dysfunction and awful things. But Joseph is blessed by God. And that means that God doesn't stop fighting for Joseph, that God never leaves Joseph, that God continues to choose him again and again and again, that each time things don't seem to go their way, God picks up the pen and says, no, we'll make this fit, we'll make this right, we'll make this work. God picks him, and he's incredibly important and valuable. Now, if you're familiar with the story, you wouldn't guess that Joseph was God's favorite because Joseph is hated, and Joseph is sold into slavery, and Joseph's wrongly accused, and he's imprisoned, and he's forgotten about and abandoned for years. And so you might wonder, how is it possible that someone who could endure all of that could still look at their own life and say, no, but I'm blessed. I'm God's favorite. How could he be blessed? How could you call that blessed by God? And maybe this morning you feel the same way. Maybe when that stuff came on the screen that said you are blessed and you are highly favored, you were like, okay, that's the person next to me. That's not me, because you don't know my life. You don't know what's happening right now. You don't know what's going on in my family, and you don't know what's going on in my marriage. You don't know about my childhood. You don't know about my diagnosis. You don't know about fill in the blank. And you might have convinced yourself that there's no way that you're highly favored. There's no way that you're blessed by God. And so as we dive into the story, I want you to know that if that's you, the story is for you. If you remember from last week, Jacob did this huge production and to meet Esau, and his son Joseph was at the very, very back. Now, at this point, Joseph is just one of 11 sons. He later has 12, and then he has one daughter, and that poor, poor little girl. But now you think that Jacob would know not to pick favorites, but as I said before, he does, and it creates this jockeying between Joseph and all of the other 11 brothers. In fact, Jacob gives Joseph this fancy clothing to make sure that everybody knows that he's the favorite. And Joseph isn't like, oh, no, Dad, come on, can we just downplay this thing? He didn't do that. He says, yes, give me that. I will wear it proudly. And then Joseph begins to have these dreams. And in these dreams, he has these visions of the sun and the moon like bowing down to him, and he knows that that's his family. And again, these reoccurring dreams come that all seem to mean that his family will one day bow down to him. Now, he doesn't keep this secret. He's this cocky, arrogant kid who goes to his family and he's like, hey, brothers, guess what? You're going to bow down to me. You want to start now? He's super obnoxious in this story. And so as a result, Joseph actually brings some great unity among his brothers. The unfortunate part is that unity is that they all hate him. They all hate him and they want him dead. And that's just, I don't know if you've ever done this in families, but that's not the kind of unity you want to bring. It's just not. So one day the brothers see an opportunity to do something about it. They want to kill him, but instead they decide to sell him into slavery and to take his fancy clothes and cover it in animal's blood. They bring it back to their dad and they say, sorry, he got eaten by a wild animal. Joseph is dead. Now they thought that this might, by getting Joseph out of the way, that maybe dad would love me more. Maybe he'd pick a new favorite and maybe it'd be me. But that doesn't happen. Instead, what happens is Jacob actually goes into this deep depression. He becomes more and more distant from the rest of his family because he's so grieved. The brothers don't get what they want. Jacob doesn't get what he wants. Joseph certainly doesn't get what he wants. He winds up as a slave in Egypt. And if that's not bad enough, there's a chance for him to sort of earn his way out of slavery one day. But that doesn't happen because someone, the wife of his owner, falsely accuses him. And so he winds up in prison. And then not only that, he winds up completely forgotten for years. For years. Until one day, when Joseph meets the servant who becomes the servant of Pharaoh. And he has a conversation with this servant. He interprets his dream. So when Pharaoh has a dream, the servant is right next to him and he says, I know a guy. I know a guy who can interpret dreams. And Joseph is pulled out of prison, brought to Pharaoh to interpret his dream. And what Joseph tells Pharaoh is, hey, I know what your dream means. There's going to be this great harvest in Egypt for years. You're going to have more food than you know what to do with. But there's going to be a downside to this. There's going to be a great famine, and there's not going to be any food. And so Joseph has the audacity to recommend a plan of action to Pharaoh. He says, listen, this is what you should do. You should store up all the grain during the season of plenty. And then, when there's no food, you'll have enough. Your people will survive. You can feed them. And Pharaoh's like, oh my gosh, this kid who wound up in prison and who's been forgotten, he's incredibly valuable. And he elevates this imprisoned slave to become the prime minister of Egypt. He puts him in charge of making sure that everyone has grain, making sure that all the grain during the plentiful season is collected and stored and then is distributed. And sure enough, when the famine hits, all of the refugees from all of the countries surrounding Egypt come to Joseph and ask for food. And he's got enough food to give them. He saves all of these people. His country and the countries surrounding, he saves everybody. But among those refugees are some significant people. His brothers. His brothers wind up coming because they're hungry and they need food. And so they come into the presence of Joseph now and are bowing before him and begging him and asking him for food. And this is every little brother's dream come true. Yes, you need what? You want what? But Joseph's heart has been changed by this point. He doesn't respond arrogantly or cockily. Instead, he gives them abundant love and mercy and probably more respect than they deserve. And he gives them the food and he saves his family as well. But by the time the book of Genesis ends, we're told that Joseph's dad, Joseph and his brother's dad, Jacob dies. And the brothers have been happy with how Joseph has been reunited to the family at this point. He's done pretty well. But the brothers are concerned that now that Jacob has died, now that dad has died, what if Joseph turns on us? What if he finally, what if he's been waiting for this moment to exact his revenge on us? And now that dad is gone and he won't protect us anymore, what if Joseph starts to harm us and he gets retribution and he wants to hurt us? What if now he's going to do something? And so the brothers decide to send Joseph a message. And the message basically, it's more, if you read the scripture, it's more words than this, but it's basically, Dad said to be nice to us. Dad's dead, but he said to be nice to us. Now, that's maybe a lie. They may have made that up. Maybe Jacob never said that. But it doesn't really matter. What it shows is the hearts of Joseph's brothers, whether it's true or not. Whether the brothers, Jacob really said that, or the brothers just kind of made it up to protect themselves, Joseph's response is that he starts to weep. He just starts to cry. And Joseph weeps because it's clear that there's sort of this disconnect between how his brothers see Joseph's life and how Joseph sees his own life. And they look at all of the events of his life and they conclude that he must be bitter and resentful and vengeful because of all the evil that they caused. And they think that we've really ruined Joseph's life and now he's really going to get us. But Joseph looks at his own life and he sees himself as blessed, as fortunate, as highly favored. And his brothers don't really get that, and so he weeps. They're so much disconnected, and they just don't get it. How is it possible? Think with me. How is it possible that someone could look at Joseph's life and see anything but disaster and deserving of revenge? And yet this is how Joseph responds. He says this to his brothers. Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Then so don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Now, Joseph's response actually reveals two things about how he sees everything that has happened in his life, everything that has been done to him. First, he poses this question to his brothers. He says, am I in the seat of God? And am I in the place of God? And what is literally asking is, do I sit in God's chair? Do I sit in God's throne? Do I sit in the seat of authority of the God Almighty? And this question sort of actually gets at this reoccurring theme that happens in Scripture again and again and again. It's kind of this idea that as humans, we really like to sit in God's seat. We really like to climb up in that big old throne and sit down and make ourselves real comfy. And you can see that from the very beginning in Genesis chapter 1, right? Adam and Eve are in the garden. Everything has been provided for them. And they're told, just don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Just leave this one alone. And then the enemy comes and says, okay, do you really want God to be telling you what is right and what is wrong? Like, can't you make your own decisions about what should be done and shouldn't be done? And what the enemy is actually tempting them to do is like, climb up into that throne. Take God's seat. And this happens over and over again. And when Adam and Eve do, things begin to spiral out of control. And when we do, things always spiral out of control. And there's so many ways that we do this in our lives. But one of the ways that we do this is by holding a grudge. And that's what Joseph's brothers are worried about, that Joseph will sort of pay back them for what they have done to him. And when Joseph says, am I in the place of God? He is saying, he's saying that anyone who holds a grudge is someone who is actively trying to pay someone back, or they've sort of passively said, well, I'm not going to do anything wrong. But if something bad happens to that person, I'm not going to stop it. I might be rooting for it, actually, but I'm not going to do it, right? That's what it means to hold a grudge. And what Joseph is saying, that if anyone's holding a grudge, it's because they think they know what the other person deserves. And they believe they have the right to dole it out. That when a person holds a grudge, they're putting themselves in the seat of God. They're climbing up into his throne, and they're ready to dole out punishments. But the problem is that anytime you put yourselves in God's seat, you find yourself incredibly underqualified for the job. Because the truth is, you actually don't know all that you need to know in order to do that. You need to know everything about what people really deserve. Do you? I don't. Do you know about their motives? Do you know about their background? Do you know about the pressures that they were under? Do you know about the cultural expectations that were surrounding them? Do you know about how their mother treated them or their father treated them? Who among us has enough knowledge to know exactly what people deserve? Not you, And definitely not me. Only God knows these things. And to be in God's seat, you have to also have the right to dole out that punishment. But when I look around, even the things that I know about the people in this room, no one in here is perfect. We've all screwed up. We've all made a mess of things sometimes. And so none of us have the ability, the right to dole out that kind of punishment. We are underqualified for that job. And Paul in Romans says it this way: do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. It's written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. Now, the shorthand version of what this verse says is that God is saying, get out of my seat. Get out of my chair. You can't do this job. You don't know all the things. So get out. And we will never be able to live the blessed life. We'll never be able to see our life as blessed if we keep hoping that we'll have a chance to get into God's chair and dole out the punishments. And so Joseph tells his brothers, I can't hold a grudge. I'm not in God's seat. And this really is a perspective about who he is. But then he says this next statement that kind of tells us a little bit of a perspective about who God is, or more so like what God is capable of. The next thing he says is, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. And some translations actually say, you intended it for evil, but God meant it for good. Now, a couple things that Joseph is telling us is, first, evil is real. Evil's a real thing. Joseph isn't saying like, oh, brothers, it wasn't that big of a deal that you sold me into slavery. I'm over it. It's fine. Oh, brothers, it wasn't a big deal that you lied to dad and said I was dead and sold me for money and I got stuck in prison. I'm fine. I'm fine. If anybody says that kind of thing about their life, you need to find them a counselor because they're not fine. Evil has happened, trauma happens, and we can't just brush it off. It is painful and it is difficult. And what Joseph is doing here is by no means just saying, pish posh, whatever, it's fine. He's not denying anything. He's taking it seriously. It was evil. What you did was evil. You intended harm. But the second thing that Joseph is communicating is he's saying that God's not the source of evil. God's not the one that caused this evil to happen in our lives. And then he's also saying that God is always works for good in the midst of that evil. In fact, when stuff is going the most evil, when stuff seems to be the most terrible, God is doing the most good, which I understand that is so hard to recognize. But God is doing incredibly good in the middle of evil situations. Sometimes it may be years before we can see what God is doing. Sometimes it's centuries, and sometimes we don't get to see it until like the last day, the end of time, where we can look back and then say, oh, God, this is how you brought it all back together. It all comes around in circles. When I was in my early 20s, I had the worst year of my life. I was really, really depressed, and had suicidal inclinations, and it was just, I was not in a good place. And I didn't know how to reach out to anybody. I didn't know how to tell anybody all of these things. And it was awful. And yet, I picked that year as the year when the trajectory of my entire life turned around. I was running from God. I was running from my call to be a pastor, to follow Jesus in this particular way. And God used that year, all the bad stuff that happened, and sort of spun it on its head and said, no, I'm going to use this for good. I'm turning this whole thing around. And so I can see that year, I can see that bad thing, and I can say, oh, that's what you were doing, God. But there are things that are happening now, I haven't figured it out yet. There are things that are happening now that I'm like, oh, I don't know why this garbage is happening. I don't know why I'm stuck in the middle of the city. I can't see it clearly yet, what God is doing. And I don't know when I'm going to be able to see it. Now, I don't know if you caught this, but when this exchange between Joseph and his brothers happened, it actually describes that his brothers came and they threw themselves down before him and they said, we're your slaves. This was Joseph's dream. This was Joseph's dream at the very beginning. This is what sort of teed off the whole thing, that Joseph had said that one day his brothers would bow before them, and here they are bowing before him. In the end, despite all of this terrible stuff, they still wound up at the same spot that God intended them to wind up from the beginning. Now, some of you have people in your life who have done some pretty harmful, hurtful, or evil things to you. And some of you have done some pretty hurtful things. And oftentimes we think that because we've done those things, or because those things have been done to us, that God's best for us, his original plan, his perfect plan for us, has kind of been shoved off the table. That plan A is no longer an option, but somehow maybe we can figure out how to settle for plan B or plan C. This is, I think, how we think about these sorts of things, that God will make it, but it's just going to be plan C. You kind of screwed up your life earlier, so plan C for you. That plan A is lost. But in terms of the real life that God has created for you, it's still available for you. It hasn't been shoved off the table because of anything anyone else has done to you or anything that you have done. Because God uses all things for good. There's this guy, Gerrit von Rad. I don't know how to say that. Gerrit von Rad, he's an Old Testament commentator, and he wrote on the book of Genesis, and I loved this quote. I loved this quote of how he described what Joseph is saying here. He says, this is the climax. God had all the strings in his hand, but the guidance of God incorporated man's evil into his saving activity. The point of the story is that God overcomes evil not merely by stopping it, which he does finally, but by so thwarting its destructive purposes. It is used to further the saving objectives of God. For if Joseph hadn't been betrayed, the family would have not been saved physically. The famine would have killed them. Or spiritually, their sins would have killed them. And what Gerrit von Rad is saying is that God doesn't just stop evil. He so thoroughly frustrates it and triumphs over it that he takes the destructive purposes of evil, of every evil act, and in the end, he only uses it to serve the accomplishments of the exact opposite of what they intended. What Joseph is saying is, not only do I not have the right or the knowledge to retaliate, but I don't have the need. I don't have the need to retaliate because I know that nothing bad that happens will win in the end. Everything will be used and will be flipped on its head to be overcome by God, and it will be woven into this new tapestry of something so much better. And Joseph's saying, now I can step back and I can see that I am blessed, that good has come. But it's not just for the good of Joseph. It's not just to make him rich and powerful. In our Western view, we take this passage and we think that it says that God will just take all the evil and he'll do good in your life by making you a better person and make you powerful and rich. And in the words, we add this Kelly Clarkson twist to it, and we say what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So live a little louder, dig a bit deeper. Is that the right words? Okay. But that's not what Joseph's saying. What Joseph is saying is he's saying what God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. The good that Joseph is talking about, he sees that God's good is not just about himself. It's bigger than himself. God's good is to take it so that all people will be saved. That the cup of suffering that was given to Joseph was done so that he could be useful, so he could serve others, so that all these people will be saved. Joseph is saying, I'll take that cup for the sake of others. And in this way, Joseph is really just this early character that's sort of like representing Jesus. Look at these parallels. He's like doing the exact same thing that Jesus did. And in John 1, we're told that Jesus came to his own, but his own did not receive him. Like Jesus is rejected by his own family. And so is Joseph. We're told that when Jesus' friends betrayed him, he was sold for 30 pieces of silver. And Joseph was also sold for silver coins. We're told that Jesus is falsely accused. He never did anything wrong, and yet he's imprisoned. And Joseph was falsely accused, and he was also imprisoned. We're told that Jesus had this opportunity to hate those who crucified him, us, who put him on that cross. But instead, Jesus says, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. He refused to climb up in God's judgment seat, and instead he put the trust in God that he would weave all of this stuff together to make something good, to redeem all the things, to save many lives, all of our lives. And he would bless all of us. That's what Jesus did. Jesus is the one that makes a way for you to be blessed in the same way that Joseph is blessed. Because of Jesus, God never gives up on his best for you. Because of Jesus, he never stops fighting for you. He never leaves you. He never says, oh, you're too far gone. I'm going to have to bring in plan B. God chooses you again and again and again. And through Jesus' work on the cross, God is sort of taking every arrow that is slung at you, every diagnosis, every broken relationship, every abuse, every rejection, every accusation, every abandonment, to bring about the redemption and the restoration of the entire world. And this is the blessing that you have been invited to participate in. And so my question for you today is, do you want to say yes? Do you want to say, yes, I want that blessing. I want to be a part of that family. I want to say yes. I want to say yes to that. I want to trust in a God who will bring all of this garbage that I have been through full circle so that I can experience the best, so that people will be saved, so that the whole world might be redeemed. Now, there are some here today that desire to declare that they are saying yes to this invitation. And the way that they're going to do that is through baptism. Baptism is this outward expression of an inward decision that a person has already made. Now, inwardly, this decision that they're made inside of them is to trust Christ's life and death and resurrection. To trust in his life, death, and resurrection, that it has brought them new life. That it has brought them this place of one day, if not in this moment, one day their life will be restored and will be redeemed, no matter what has happened, no matter what they have done, no matter what has been done to them. It's this inward decision that they acknowledge that because of Jesus, they will be blessed, that Jesus will keep his promise to redeem and restore everything, and that they trust in Jesus and will give their life to follow him. Now, outwardly, what happens here is we're reenacting Christ's death and resurrection. His death is when we go under the water, and his resurrection is when we come back out of the water. And we sort of symbolize in that whatever has held us back from walking into this relationship with Jesus, our sin or past evil or whatever else it might be, all of that is gone. Whatever has held us back is gone, and now we walk forward in new life, in new blessing, to be a part of all that God has promised for us. Now, I'm going to invite the band to come up, because what I wanted to do today is I wanted to make the spiritual significance of baptism something that was real and tangible. And I need everyone to help make this happen. Now, under your seat, there's a little piece of paper and a pencil. And you can grab those. And I want to invite each of you to write a quick blessing or a prayer for those who are going to get baptized today. It could be something like, may you always know that God is with you. It could be something like, may you trust that God will work all things for your good and the saving of many lives. It could be something like, I pray that you would experience the peace of God. It can be whatever you want it to be, but you're going to write a blessing or a prayer on this piece of paper. Now, as the band plays, what I'm going to ask you to do is to get up by rows. So the first row will go first. And you'll walk over to the baptismal with your piece of paper, and your whole rows from either side will surround the baptismal. And you'll read your blessing and your prayer out loud. Now, you're all going to be doing it at one time. So you don't have to wait for each other, and you don't have to be self-conscious that maybe somebody will hear you. It doesn't matter. You're all reading together. And once you all have read your blessing or your prayer, you'll drop your piece of paper in the water. And you'll notice that as the paper dissolves, the blessing and the prayer will remain on the surface of the water. Because this is what happens when we experience baptism. We enter into all of the blessings that God bestows upon Christ. We are immersed in everything he has for us. None of it is held back because he says, oh, but you did, or oh, but you were. God just pours out all of those blessings on us when we choose him, when we decide to trust in him. And now after you put your piece of paper into the water, I'm going to ask that you would go back to your seat and that you would just continue to pray that prayer and speak that blessing again and again, that you would sort of breathe it in and out in the same way that you breathe. You don't have to elaborate on the prayer. You can do the same 6 words or whatever it is, but just keep praying that prayer as you're in your seat. And allow the other people to come to the baptismal to put their blessing or their prayer into the water, and resist the temptation to talk to others or to leave the room for a second. Just sort of be in this space and allow the amazing reality of what God is doing, of what happens in baptism, just kind of soak in. Now afterwards, once everybody's paper is in the baptismal, you're going to pray for those. Well, I'm going to come up and I'm going to pray for those getting baptized today. And it's going to be this time of great celebration for those who have chosen to trust Christ. Now, may we help them celebrate by pouring out our blessings and our prayers on those who will be baptized.